Today is August 31st, 2023. My name is Ian Kim, and I'm with the Houston Asian American Archive. This is a continuation of the interview with Cyrus Bharucha, a member of the Zoroastrian community in Houston. Thank you so much for allowing me to interview you today again.
Thank you.
So last time we sort of talked about your early life in our last interview, and you talked about your time in boarding school in England, and we sort of touched upon the activities that you did there, but we didn't really talk about any of the activities you did outside of school. So I kind of wanted to touch on that a bit. So can you talk about some of the activities that you did, like that were not completely academic, or some things that you did with your friends in your free time or anything like that?
Okay. Well, most of the time when I was at school, I used to go home to my uncle and aunt in Croydon. And sometimes my cousin was with me, and other times he went back to Burma for his vacations, but I didn't go back to India. So a lot of my time was spent going to the cinema. I spent a great deal of time in the movies. In fact, like one teacher at one time told me when I was half asleep in class, said, Bharucha, you spend half your time in darkness. Either you're asleep or in the cinema. And that was to some extent quite true, actually. And I love cricket. It's my favorite sport. And so during the vacations, I would go to the Oval, which was the big cricket ground near me. And I belonged to a club called the Eagle Club, which was a comic paper in those days for boys. And it allowed you to go to watch the cricket after the tea interval. A cricket match, probably most Americans don't know, lasts the whole day. It starts at 11 o'clock, then it has a lunch break, then it continues and it goes on till 4 o'clock, and then it has a tea break for 15 minutes, and then it continues till 6:30. And I was allowed to go in there after the tea break, so at 4 o'clock. And once the people at the gate got to know me, and they asked me, why do I come always at 4 o'clock? So I told them that my comic book membership only allows me. So he says, oh, don't worry about that. You can come in any time. So I started to go for the whole day, and I'd take sandwiches with me, and I would sit there for the whole day. It was wonderful. But the big thing for me was to go to the cinema. I would go and see at least 3 films a week, at least. In those days, it was very cheap. It used to cost about one shilling and sixpence, which I can't even calculate today into dollars, but it was very cheap. And I think the dollar was $5 in those days, so you can work it out. I think no, sorry, it was, yes, the dollar was 5 shillings. That's right. $1 was 5 shillings. So anyway, I used to go to the cinema, and in those days you saw 2 films in one showing. They always had a B film and the main film, plus a cartoon, plus newsreels, plus trailers. So it was really a whole afternoon or evening you would spend at the cinema. And that was my passion. The other thing was to go to the theater. So I would go a lot. My uncle and aunt in the early days would take me because I couldn't afford to pay for myself to go to the theater. So that would be charged up to my mother's account. But concerts and theaters. So I was always involved in the arts in one form or another.
So do you go watch those films with your friends, or was this like always alone, or?
And it was either with my cousin Zal, and if he was there, we would go together. Otherwise, during the summer holidays when he wasn't there, I'd go alone. Yeah, most of it, 90% of the time I'd be alone. Yeah.
Did you have any like favorite movies or favorite shows or anything like that?
Yes, I would say I liked detective films. I like big romance films. Um, and one year, I was my 1 year, because before my final year, I went to Rome, and I had one of the great experiences of my teenage life. we were staying in a pension in Rome, and this was with a friend from school, John Barnard, and the lady who owned the pension asked us one day at breakfast, the usual thing, you ask 16-year-old schoolboys, what are you going to do when you grow up? And I said, I'd like to become a film director and be in films. And she said, oh, really? She says, my Pietro, my son, he's a assistant film director. You know, they're filming Ben-Hur in. I said, yes, I know, at Cinecittà. Would you like to go? And I said, yes, I would love to go. And so she arranged it with Pietro, and we were dressed up as extras. We had to wear a kaftan, and we went in this massive set. I mean, the whole arena was where the chariot race was being filmed. And we were shoved in the crowd in his section. There were lots of assistant directors, and Pietro happened to be one of them. And the main assistant director was the man who finally wound up directing A Fistful of Dollars and making Clint Eastwood into a star. But anyway, that's another story. Anyway, so we were put in this crowd, and William Wyler, who was the overall director, but wasn't directing the chariot race, was on a Lambretta scooter, and he came round saying hello to Pietro and checking on him, and he introduced us. And he said to me, what do you want to be, kid? And I said, well, I want to be, instead of saying like you, sir, like a bloody fool, I said, oh, like Elia Kazan, who was a very famous director, but unfortunately was under the sort of whole communist problem in those days in the 50s. So that's a story to get into another time. But anyway, so he took me on his Lambretta, and I went round and I met Stephen Boyd, who was playing Marcello, and I had lunch with the crew, and I went up on the crane and with the director of photography, and it was just a fantastic day. And I've always remembered that day. It was my first day seeing a real movie being shot.
Yeah, that sounds like an amazing experience. I actually went to Rome this summer and it was a beautiful place. And I went to the Parthenon as well, but not an experience like that.
I've been to Rome 8 times since then. And Italy in general. I love Italy. In fact, had I not wound up in Texas, I'd always planned to retire in Italy. But I was married at the time. Now I'm not, so.
Yeah, it's a beautiful place. You said you went to Rome 8 times. So did you like travel a lot during like your early years or?
Yeah, even right from the beginning, from starting there in 58, this would be when I was 16, I went to Rome. And then the next year, I went to India. And then after that, I went to Paris in 1960, again with my school friend. And he was a Chinese from Malaya. And then from there to Dusseldorf the following year to another friend. I've kept in touch with a lot of friends and visited them. So yes, and then I joined the BBC and I traveled a lot with the BBC. I literally went around the world. And after leaving the BBC, I've been around the world 4 times now. Yeah.
Yeah, that that sounds amazing. Um, and I also want to know if there were like any specific like bonding moments that you had with like either your friends or your aunt and uncle, like that like really stand out. Sort of like the one you talked about with the thing that happened in Rome with like the cinematography stuff. Were there any other experiences like that?
Yes, my uncle was my uncle and aunt were a couple that really sort of brought me up. I should say I lived with them more than brought me up. Um, my uncle was a remarkable man. He was English, and my aunt was my mother's sister, so she was obviously Parsi and Zoroastrian. And he was a man of many talents. he was a accountant by profession, but he was a brilliant pianist. He was a fellow of the Royal College of Music. He could turn his hand on a lathe. He could make all kinds of things, and he had a remarkable brain that even when I was doing photography, I couldn't understand some of the chemistry of it, and he could just read it up and explain it to me. So he was a wonderful teacher. Unfortunately, my aunt and uncle didn't have the best of marriages later on, and sadly, they stayed together, but it wasn't a very happy household for a long time. But I just had to live there because that's where I was brought up until I was 24. And then I was with the BBC and I was earning very well. So I could leave, and I found myself in a great space in a flat in the King's Road in an area called Chelsea, which was a very trendy area in those days in London. And in fact, everyone was very envious of me of having a large apartment in Chelsea, which I shared with my dear friend Alan, who was here just recently, Alan Moore, who I met at the BBC. But the amazing thing of that apartment was that Alan never lived there, not one night. But he was very honorable, and he paid his share of the rent every month without fail, and never lived there. So I had this whole apartment to myself, and my whole social life really took off at that point, because this was the mid-60s. It was swinging London. The pill had come in, so sexually things were very free, much freer than they were in this country. It took a while for this country to catch up to Europe and England. But and drugs were very free, but I was never into drugs and never drank much. I wasn't into alcohol and drink because the film business revolves around alcohol a great deal. Not so much with drugs in those days, at least, but certainly with alcohol. But I wasn't really interested in that. But I like women. I like girls. So there was a lot of, and girls, it was a time when it became very free. Sex was very free and so forth. So we had lots of parties, especially in my place, because it was large, and and a lot of people loved coming into Chelsea. And unfortunately, what happened was people could hear the party going up on the second floor, and you could look into it from the other side of the road. So people would knock on the door and people would just let people in. So half the time I was looking around and I didn't know half the people in the place, So it was very kind of free and easy in those days.
Just so I get this correct, so this was after you moved out of like your aunt and uncles and moved into like an apartment by yourself?
This would be 1966.
Okay. I'm might be misremembering this, but I remember in our last interview, you said that during college, you didn't really have that much of a social life, partially due to like so much work and the distance between you and your friends, like, geographically. So I assume this happened afterwards, when you started like getting jobs and stuff.
Well,
Um,
I
yeah.
joined right after I passed out of college. But if you remember, we talked about I did what they call a work-study course in those days. So I was working at the Science Museum as a photographer, and I was going to school every Tuesday, and Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday were night school. So I went to night school every for the rest of the week. So I really didn't. I had one or two good close friends in those days, but I didn't have a lot of money either, so I couldn't go out spending too much money. But we went a lot to plays and for movies and things like that.
So like there was like this huge change in like your social like activeness, right? So like how would that like feel? Like, I don't know, just
It was
tell me more about that, I guess.
the first weekend I woke up in my apartment was an extraordinary feeling because I didn't have my aunt yelling at me, Cyrus, come down, you've got chores to do, this, that, the other. It was just the most marvelous feeling of being able to lie in bed and think, this is all mine now. I love it, and it was wonderful. It was complete what I considered freedom at that time. Not, in all fairness to my uncle and aunt, they never pushed me to about I had to be in at a certain time or anything like that. They were very free and easy with me. And I also, one didn't get into a lot of trouble in those days. I mean, I wasn't interested in drugs or doing alcohol or anything like that. I wouldn't have the money anyway. I mean, I just had enough to live basically in a comfortable way. And I used to give them a certain amount of money every week. And that was it.
I see. So when you were able to like have all these parties, like you mentioned that like on the first floor, like like lots of people started coming in. Like, can you tell me some of your experiences with that? Uh, just in more detail, I guess.
Well, there was a lot of sex, put it that way. A lot. I mean, it was you met people sometimes that night, and you woke up, and it was a Saturday night, Sunday morning experience. Um, there was a lot of that, and because I had all these empty rooms as well, you'd find people sort of half dressed or undressed, walking around on on Sunday morning, you know. So there was a lot of that going on. Um, People smoked a lot in those days. I didn't. I hated smoking, but um, people smoked a lot. So from the studio, from I would bring back empty film cans and put them all over the flat because then people could stub their cigarettes out in those days. And there was a lot of drinking, so a lot of whiskey and always quite expensive. So it was a lot of wine and beer drinking. And I never saw anyone get wildly, unpleasantly drunk or anything like that. But I think people were high, and a lot of that went on. Yeah.
Also, oh yeah, what were you about to say? Okay. I saw that like you run a club nowadays. Like, is there any sort of like differences in like party culture now compared to like back then? If you have any idea.
Club I run now is called That's Entertainment. In fact, what we do is we're all, over 60 years old now. So we take people to different events all over the city. We go to the symphony, we go to plays. We went to last Sunday. We went to see stages. Always Patsy Cline, so country music. We go to all kinds of things. We're going to the Duke Ellington concert soon. So we go to all kinds of events all over the city, art, art museums.
There's just like one last question I want to talk about like your like the partying and everything. Is since this was all in England, I assume, was there like a difference between like England and the US when you moved to the US or was that
No, when I really moved to the US, well, the first came to the US was in 1970. I was still with the BBC, and I came with the BBC 3 times before I actually moved here. And each time I was based for 3 to 4 months in New York, and then we traveled all over America. And 1970 was fascinating because it was the period of the Vietnam riots that were going on, the Black Panthers, and so forth. And we met with a lot of them. We met with several of the Black Panthers. We covered riot after riot and demonstration after demonstration almost every weekend. I was at oh, sorry, my mind's just gone for a minute. Come back to it in a second. But we covered all sorts of situations in Yale, at New Haven, and in Ohio at Kent State. That's what I was trying to think of. At Kent State University, when the shootings took place, and I was right there when that happened. And they killed a couple of people, including a young man called Johnny Glenn Miller, who actually wound up with that famous cover on Time magazine with the girl holding his head and screaming with her hand up. So we were there, we saw a lot. I mean, it was part of history and we saw it being done. And then I came back again in 71, and that wasn't such an eventful place, except that we went to Lake Havasu, and when London Bridge was put over Lake Havasu, and we met with the man who did that. And then I came back in 74 again, and then I decided, I would leave the BBC, and we've gone into that story. And I came here in 76. So you were asking, by that time, America had caught up socially, I would say, with Europe. And so things were very, so fairly free and easy, even in America. Yeah. And America was a very interesting, very different to what it is today, sadly.
So like going on with the BBC, like we talked a lot about that last time. We talked about like a lot of your work in England, but we didn't really get into much with like your work, the work that you did in the United States, mostly because of time. So can we like sort of talk about that? So like some of the jobs you did, like the differences between the work culture in like the US and the UK.
Yes. The BBC work culture was very strict in the sense that you did certain things in a very organized kind of way, and there was a hierarchy, much more of a hierarchy than there is in America. America was much more casual. But at the BBC, especially when I started in the 60s, that has changed a lot today. But as an assistant cameraman, you are literally told to carry a matchbox with you. Why? Because the cameraman, who was your boss, so to speak, wanted his cigarette and you would have to light it for him. I refused to do it. Just refused to do things like that. But that's a kind of nonsense that was expected at the BBC at the beginning. It all changed. I think our generation, because we came from college and a different kind of background, most of us kind of refused to do stuff like that, and it just that was it. But in America, it was much more casual. Everyone was on first name terms and so forth. And also the technical language was very different in America, especially in television. Give you an example. When you go from one shot to another in a television studio, in England, we would say mix from camera A to camera B, so that there would be a sort of dissolve in the shot. Over here, you would actually use the word dissolve. The room where the technical work is done in America is called a control room. In England, it's called the gallery. And mainly because usually it's upstairs and you're looking down at the studio in England. Whereas in America, very often it's on the same level. So it's always the control room and so forth. There were all kinds of American jargons that I had to learn. And also the Americans found my British jargon sort of quaint and funny and stuff like that, so that there was a lot of that went on. And of course I came from a very highly technically area in England, the BBC being what it was. So to come and work at PBS in a regional station like Washington or Minneapolis, the people weren't that well trained in those days, quite frankly. They were very keen and wanted to learn, and eventually did. I mean, they were eventually became outstanding. But I noticed that when I first went there, I was sort of quite shocked at the technical level and the lack of training that there was. So that was a big surprise. But America gave me opportunities to do things that I would never have had staying in England. I was able to do all kinds of shows here that I would never have been able to do in England. So that was a great opportunity.
Can you tell me more about those shows that you mentioned?
I'll give you, for example, I was given a chance to create an old show. So the flagship station for the Midwest is the Minneapolis St. Paul station. It was then called KTCA. It's got different letters to it now, but it was KT. So it dealt with all the Midwest stations, Wisconsin, Iowa, Minneapolis, all that long. And so I created an arts program, and we called it Wild Rice, because wild rice, as you know, is grown in that area. But we called it WYLD. And we did a program every week, every Friday, and it became the second most watched program on the networks. It beat the networks out, actually, which for PBS to do that is absolutely wonder. Then the biggest thing I did, two big things that I did, which I got an opportunity to do. The Chinese People's Republic, for the first time, was sending a troupe of artists to this country. It was a troupe of 180 people. It was and so they were performing at the Metropolitan in New York. And one of the places on their tour, San Francisco, New York, Washington, D.C., and Minneapolis. So the producer who was working with me at the time, Mark, suggested, why don't we try and do the show from here for the whole PBS network? And so I was sent to New York to negotiate with the Chinese. And they had really, CBS was there, the Boston station, which was very powerful in those days, WGBH was there. David Susskind, who was a very big independent producer, he was there. And I thought, oh, hell, I mean, we're never going to get this. But anyway, I had a meeting with Mr. Shea, who was in charge of it. And the way I got him was I said that we were at that time showing a series of Chinese films, which was done by an American or British producer, host. And he'd done a whole series of these films in China. And I told him about that. And I said, we are public television. We are the people's television, Gave him that whole spiel. And to my surprise, he called me in the second day and he said, yes, we'll do the show with you, because we see all these other people as capitalists and so forth. Remember, this is 1978. So China was just beginning to flower. And they gave us the show. So they came, each show was 3 hours long, two completely separate shows. And one show was the rehearsal. So we filmed the rehearsal, then we filmed the entire 3 hours of the first show, and then the second show. And finally, we spent the next 4 months editing it, and it became an award-winning show. And unfortunately, we thought that we would win the Emmy for it because it was without question. We got terrific write-ups all over the country when it was shown. It was the second most viewed show in PBS history. And unfortunately, what happened was in those days you had to send out um, sort of the equivalent of VHS, which has just come in, to people all over the country to watch the show if they hadn't seen it and vote for it on the Emmys. And unfortunately, Coca-Cola, who was the big backer of our show, backed out. And the reason they backed out was the Chinese government asked them not to push the fact that Coke was the big thing that was coming to China, because they wanted to make out that what they were really interested in was the technology that was coming into China and not some soft drink, and that was the big publicity that had been going around, was Coke has got into China. I mean, it's massive for Coke, of course, but so they backed off. And unfortunately, we didn't have the money to publicize it, and we lost out on it. And but it was nominated, but we didn't get it.
Still, that must have been like an amazing experience just participating in all this.
No, it was a terrific experience, and something I'm very proud of, because we not only got the deal, but the amount of publicity we got on it nationwide, which is quite remarkable. Yeah.
Yeah, and like you were the one who sort of like started it off because like you were the one negotiating.
Yeah. And the other thing that I was very proud of, and again, this was because I had a great boss, the late Bill Coben, gave me all these opportunities. The other thing that was happening was Francis Coppola, who directed the Godfather films and amongst all the others, had made a deal with a person called Kevin Brownlow, who's since then won an Oscar for his work on silent films. And he had put together a film called Napoleon. It's a very long story, which I won't go into. But Napoleon was finally edited down to 4.5 hours. And it's a silent film with music. And they wanted to have a showing of the film with some music in Minneapolis at the Walker Arts Center. So I was then asked if I would like to make a film on that. So I said, well, it would be interesting if you could get Abel Gance, who made the film, to come here. And I knew about Abel Gance because behind me is a book called The Parade's Gone By, and Kevin Brownlow's book. It's the definitive book on silent films. And Abel Gance, it's dedicated to Abel. So I knew about him, and I knew he was still alive. So I asked Kevin if he could put me in touch with him. And Kevin said, you must be joking. He's 93 years old. I could come all the way to Minneapolis for you. So then I called up another friend of mine who was at the American Film Institute, and he said something on the same lines. I don't know to this day how, I can't remember how I got his address, but I did. And my PA at that time was a former French teacher. And so I got Marianne to write him a letter and say that if you're interested, I understand you have a lot of girlfriends. And he was quite the lad when he said, so I said, you can bring one of your girlfriends over, or I can send my assistant who speaks French fluently to bring you. So we got a cable back. I will come, but I'm not bringing any old girlfriend. I want your assistant to come and bring me back. So that's exactly what happened. And we eventually made a film on that. and it was a remarkable experience. I mean, here was one of the great pioneers of the cinema, and he came here. He met with Francis Coppola's father, um, um, Carmine Coppola, and that led me, after I left the BBC, after I left PBS 2 years later, to eventually take the film of Napoleon around the country with Carmine conducting symphony orchestras. So I was coming to Houston, but unfortunately they couldn't accommodate the technical problems of it, because you had to have 3 projectors, because at the very end, the film goes from 1 screen into 3 screens. And it's the original Cinerama. And 3 projectors come on, 1 in the center and 2 like this, and come onto the screen. And it's fantastic. And so I took it around the country, which was a great experience.
Yeah, last time we only talked about Wings of Fire, and then we didn't really talk about any other films that you made. So, like, this must have been your passion project, right? Or
But great. I mean, I also earned some money from it as well, because I just left CNN. I'd been at CNN for only a very short time, and that was one of the big stupid mistakes of my life. They actually offered me a job, which I told them I didn't want. And then when I resigned from there, they came back 2 weeks later and offered me another job and said, I could be in charge of the whole weekend. And I should have taken it. And to this day, I don't know why I didn't. It was one of those bad decisions one makes in life, and one makes mistakes. And that was one of my biggest mistakes I ever made. But it did lead me to working with Francis Coppola's company, not with him personally, but with the company and with his father. So the 2 of us traveled a lot.
I see. Were there any other films that you were like specifically proud of, or like anything else that like sort of stood out to you?
Film with, you can see the photograph behind me here, with George Plimpton. I did several films. I did a whole series with, okay, one of the things that I'm very proud of was in 1982, I had the opportunity going back to PBS and working with them in Washington with American University, who'd got the contract for a series called From Crisis to Crisis. And the host of that series was a lady called Barbara Jordan, who was the representative from Austin, and someone that President Lyndon Johnson had promoted in a very big way. And she became extremely famous at that time because of the Watergate. Because when they were trying to impeach President Nixon, she gave one of the most brilliant speeches on the American Constitution and why Nixon should be impeached. And she became very famous for that. So now, years later, she had just retired and was professor emeritus at the Texas University in Austin, at School of the Lyndon Johnson School of Political Science. And so she was the host of that show. So I had to fly down to Austin every 2 weeks to do the links with her in the studio, and got to know her quite well. And that was one of the great moments. Did we ever talk about my meeting with Muhammad Ali?
Oh yeah, we did talk a little bit about it. Mostly the Zoroastrian aspect though. Like, you were you didn't really know that much about Zoroastrianism during that time. Yeah.
Okay, fine. That's right. Okay, I'm trying to think of some of the sort of people that I met. And so Barbara Jordan was definitely, I would rate her very highly. I think we talked about Maria Callas as well, the great opera singer, who's also on my shelf at the back. And then the other person I worked with, you asked about films that I made, which were again nominated for the Emmy, was this post behind me with George Plimpton. George Plimpton was in the 60s. If anyone who was around at that time would remember George Plimpton, because he had a show on TV, I think on ABC or CBS, called I Was There, where George actually took part in whatever he did. For example, the one that became very famous was when he played for the Detroit Tigers. It was called The Paper Tiger. It became a movie as well with Alan Alda in it playing George's part. And he joined the Detroit Tigers and to try and play as the quarterback. And finally, in a real game, they put him in right at the end. And but during his time with the Detroit Tigers, he had a very hard time because they all thought he was a bit of a joke, and until he actually played, and they was actually quite good. For example, he went to cover Lawrence of Arabia being filmed, and he was made one of the extras in the famous scene where Lawrence shoots his Arab friend and things like that. So George had written the definitive book on fireworks. So when I was at PBS, we started the show on fireworks with the Grucci family, which is the sort of premier family of fireworks in this country. And I got fired. And but they liked me, and George and I got on. And so I took the footage that we had at the PBS station, and it took me a year, and I eventually found A&E, Arts and Entertainment channel, and they loved it. They literally watched it for 3 minutes and turned around, offered me it's the quickest pitch I've ever had in my life, and they gave me $140,000 to make the film, which I did. And George worked with us, and we were nominated for the Emmy again. And unfortunately, we didn't win, but it was there. So, and then in India, I made several films when I went there. A lot of corporate films, but the last film I made before I really retired was on a man called Nani Palkhiwala, which would mean absolutely nothing to you, but if you talk about it to India, he was the greatest jurist India's ever had, and one of the great what would you call Renaissance man that I've ever known. He was a big industrialist, very in the House of Tartars. He was a chairman of several major companies. He was, as I say, one of the great jurists of India. In fact, he saved India's democracy, which is a very long story to go into now. But he literally, and the thing that he became very famous for in India was called the budget speech. Now, he was an economist, but a lay economist. And every year when the budget came out in India, he would go out and speak about it to a crowd in a cricket stadium. And without exaggeration, 100,000 people would come to listen to him. Now, who would listen to a speech on any budget in anywhere in the world except in India? Because he made it so interesting, so funny, and figures that came out of his head like this. I mean, if you were to watch the film, I've got extracts of him, and people just blew their minds when they heard him speak. And literally, people jam-packed cricket stadiums to watch him. And so he became very famous in India. If you to a certain now he's been gone sadly for 20 years, but up to that time, if you mentioned the name Nani Palkiwala, people would go, wow, it's really something. So that was my last film, and I knew him very well because he was the man who helped me raise money for On Wings of Fire. So became a very dear friend as well.
I see. I sort of want to get into that as well, like some of the most important people in your life, not just like, like how famous they were or like how, influential they were, but like some people who were like really close to your heart. So I sort of wanted to ask about that.
It's a That's a difficult question, only because I can't say that I didn't have a lot of adults very close to me growing up. As I mentioned, I lost my father when I was very young. I was sent to England. I was at boarding school all since the age of 3 to 17. My uncle in England was quite close to me at the beginning when I was 12, 13, 14. But then afterwards, I think he sort of lost interest because of his marriage situation with my aunt. So even what I did find were people who gave me breaks rather than influenced me. So at the BBC, there was a man called Reno Wideson who I kept in touch with long after I left, right up to 10 years ago when he was 93 years old. And I went to meet him. And he helped me get into the BBC. A man called Peter Pagnamenta, who gave me my first break as a producer and had a lot of faith in me and gave me really the opportunity to do things. So I would put Peter up there. Then my Alvin Goldstein, who got me into PBS, who helped me get into and Bill Coben, who was my boss in Minneapolis, who gave me opportunities. And my very dear friend, who's still alive, called Reggie Poe. Now, Reggie was African American, and he was married to Colleen, who was white, and they had 2 children who become like my nephews. And he has helped me a great deal in my life. Rather than being a mentor, he's given me a lot of opportunities and been there for me as a friend, in terms of even offering me work. In fact, it started, one of the first jobs I ever got in America was through another friend, a mutual friend, who gave me a job with Reggie, one of my very early jobs in 1976. And then after that, we got to know each other and then became extremely close friends. And I consider him like my elder brother. And we talk every 2 weeks, even now. So that's the only way I could say is people who helped me rather than people who were my mentors or had someone to look up to. I didn't, to be honest.
I see. So, can you tell me, like especially Reggie, who seems who seems to have helped you a great deal. Can you tell me like one specific story about him, or like something that sort of made him seem like, or maybe it was like an accumulation of things?
It's really an accumulation of things. When I didn't have a job, he gave me an office. He gave me a place to work in, and he had a very large office at that time. He was in the educational publication business. So they used to create educational programs for people like Prentice Hall, Macmillan's, all these big publishing houses would give them contracts to do multi-million-dollar projects. And if ever there was any movies to be made or films or videos to be done, he would always put them onto me. And so even when I wasn't earning anything, but he always gave me an office, so I always had somewhere to go to. And that was, he's always been very thoughtful and kind to me from that point of view. And so every now and again, whenever a big job came in, all the media stuff would come my way. So in that sense, he looked after me. And we did a project with Alex Haley, you know, who wrote Roots, the famous book Roots. And Alex, of course, was a very famous author. And through Reggie, I got to know him. And we wound up going down to his place in Knoxville, where he had a big farm in Tennessee, and working with him. And so all those opportunities Reggie would give me. So I would say if anyone has been really helpful to me in my life, especially in the last, since the 80s, would be Reggie, without doubt. Yeah.
Yeah. With all the things he has like given you and provided for you, like no wonder he's so like close to you and like
And he did that for my ex-wife as well. When I was married with Ghazala, he gave, and she didn't have she was in between jobs and she was pushing her own little company to do things. He gave her the opportunity to do that. So he gave her an office and she had the run of the office actually. So, and never charged a penny, never, ever.
yeah, learning about like all like your friend, especially Reggie, is like I kind of wish I could have like a friend like that in the future as well. Like just
In life, you know, people come along. I told you the story about how I got $100,000 from talking to one person, Leonard Garner, for 2 hours. You know, never expecting to get a penny from him. Not that I wanted it, and he came and offered me $100,000, which was fantastic. You know, you never know in life. That I must say, has I've been lucky in that way. That just when you just think everything is down, something happens. And I always think there's somebody up there likes me. You know, you feel you're on the edge of a cliff and you're about to fall over, and someone grabs you and pulls you back. And it'll happen in life to you. Yeah, you've got long, long way to go yet.
I think those are very wise words. Just like, you know, always having hope, I think. I also kind of want to move over to some of the like interests and hobbies that you have. Like, so obviously, like filming, like watching movies, and like you said earlier, cricket. Those have been like some of the hobbies that you've done, but were there any others like
Yeah,
those
painting. I've written 2 books, and they've both been published. Um, and it all started off, the book started off with never thinking I could ever write anything, write a book. It's like when I first thought I could never write a film script, and then I did, and it happened, and I made the film. And the same thing happened with the book. The true story behind that is that I was very depressed after my divorce, and I went to see a psychiatrist, and he said to me, you know, Cyrus, you're very good at telling stories. Have you ever thought of writing it down? I said, no, yeah, I wouldn't be interested. He said, no, that's what you should do. You know, just start writing something. And so I thought, well, why not? You know, so I started to write this book, which first book took me 13 years to finish because I'd write a bit and then I wouldn't look at it for months on end. Then I'd come in, then I'd get a backache, then I'd stop writing and so forth. So the first book took 13 years and it's called Bollywood Beds and Beyond. And it has parts of my story in it, but in a fictional way and so forth. And it took me a long time because it kind of evolved like Topsy, you know, it just grew and grew. The second one just took me a year because by that time it's a sequel and I knew some of the characters already. So I took that, and also I got to know how to write the book a little bit better as well. So that took a year, and it was a much shorter book as well. But it's a sequel to the first one. So that took up. I like doing that. I haven't done that in a while, and I've taken up painting. My grandfather was a painter. My uncles were artists. My aunt was. So I've taken up painting. I'm a hobby artist. I don't take it myself seriously, but I've been very lucky because the Zoroastrian Association here has taken my paintings for auction, so to raise money for, especially for the young people there, and give them scholarships. And to my surprise, people have actually bought my paintings, maybe just out of goodwill towards the scholarship. But I believe some of them are actually hanging up. And someone said the other day they saw my painting in someone's home. I said, "Oh wow, that's nice." So I've taken up painting, yeah. And I was playing pickleball a lot. I had to stop playing tennis because my elbow was hurting. But I've had a surgery done here now, and I have a prosthetic in here instead of my bones. So I haven't played pickleball now since February, since my operation, because I'm a bit scared of falling, which I have done on the court, and then hurt his hand. So so that's unfortunately stopped. But I swim. And last year I was very proud. I went with a friend to Mexico. We went in one of these underground rivers, and I swam for a whole mile, which I thought at the age of 80 to do that was pretty good. So I do that anyway. So there we are.
Yeah, I would say that's more than pretty good, I think. And
But I had to stop along every 200 yards, every 200 meters. One had to sort of take a break. There was sort of landing station. A lot of people would get out, but I have to give credit to my partner there, Lorraine. She's at the age in her 60s. She's the weightlifting champion of Asia. And she was the one who said, "Come on, you've got to try. You've got to keep going." So I give her all the credit for that swim, that she was the one who kept me going. In fact, normally I'm the strongest swimmer, but she had the stamina. I can do laps in the pool, but she had the stamina, and she kept me going. So I do that. I swim. I go to the gym. Um, as one gets a bit older, your interests get a bit less and less, and things that you can do.
yeah, I also definitely resonate with the part where you like how you wrote a book, because I'm actually trying to write a book right now. Hopefully it doesn't take 13 years, but
Yeah, you find you'll go through several drafts of it. You go back. See, one of the things I found that when I was writing the book, by the way, is if you don't do it at a regular pace, which I didn't the first time, you find yourself repeating stuff because you've forgotten what you wrote, 7 chapters back. So when someone was editing my book, she found that constantly I was repeating myself on certain things and certain stories or incidences or whatever they were. And so great chunks had to be taken out. And so the thing to do is to be, my great I'm a great fan of Jeffrey Archer, who's written all these great novels, and Frederick Forsyth, and they talk about how they're so disciplined. They go into a special room, lock themselves up from 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock till 5 o'clock, and they just write, and they don't want anyone disturbing them. And I wasn't that disciplined at all. I would sort of go to it and then oh, where did I leave off? Oh, I read the last chapter. Then you find you repeating yourself. So be a little disciplined about it.
yeah.
I was in the first book, even in the second book to some extent, I was really coming up with a storyline as I went along. So it's better if you can have the storyline in your head and write down some headings that your character is going to go from A to B to C to D, that way.
Yeah, during the summer, I've been like spending 6 to 9 hours writing every day. Um, and I had to do redrafts and everything. I'm still on chapter one. Yeah.
So what's your story?
It's a fantasy story, so it's like a modern fantasy sci-fi kind of thing. Yeah.
See, that's something I couldn't do because I'm not very good at sci-fi stuff. In fact, I can't even watch a lot of sci-fi film. I mean, my favorite sci-fi film of all times is 2001, and I loved Arthur Clarke's book. I didn't understand the film when I first saw it, nor did 90% of the people who first saw it in 1968. In fact, 20th Century Fox, who made the film, wanted to dump it. They said, "What the hell is it about?" But the generation, my generation, which was that 20s generation, who were in their 20s, and we got it. And although we didn't get, then I read Arthur Clarke's book, Arthur C. Clarke's book, 2001, and I thought, wow, now I got it. Then I went back to see it, and I thought, oh, it's brilliant. So if you've never seen, have you seen 2001?
No, I've definitely heard of it though. Yeah.
You must read the book. Read the book, Arthur C. Clarke's book. Any library will have it. And it's a very short. It's a short book, actually, a short novel. But when you've read the book and then see the film, wow, it really comes to life. It's just brilliant.
Yeah, I'll have to put that on the reading list. Yeah.
Missed out on time. When I was at the BBC, when I first went there, we used to have these comp days or standby days, when you just had to stand by and just sit in the cafe and drink coffee until, if someone was out, you got called in, you had to take over. But most days you just sat around. And MGM was making 2001 at the time. So some of us boys get in the car, drive up to Bornham Woods, and watch Stanley Kubrick making the film. That was a big thrill for us, because we were all these 21, 22-year-old kids, and we were watching this amazing film being made. But if you like science fiction, go read Arthur C. Clarke and Ray Bradbury. Do you read Ray Bradbury?
Yeah, I definitely read his. Yeah. Those are very great. I really love his stories.
Yeah.
I also want to ask, like, since you're retired now and like, obviously you did swimming, like what were some things that you were able to do now that like you haven't imagined you would have been able to do, with like so much more time on your hands that like since you're not working anymore. So
Nothing really. In fact, I have a hard time accepting the fact that I'm 81 years old. I really do. I really have a very hard time accepting that. I, because I want to do so many things that I wanted to, that I used to do, which frankly, physically, I can't do today. As I say, I mean, just simple like playing pickleball because of this confounded operation now I had, and I can't do that, and I miss that. I used to play all the racket sports: squash, tennis, racquetball, now pickleball. But couldn't do that today. But the question was, what can I do today that I'm retired? Nothing really. No, nothing that I can think of. I painted before, I paint now. People keep asking me to write another book because although it wasn't some big seller, it sold some, and people enjoy. It's a very fast read. Everyone says that. In fact, one critic called it it's like on a runaway train. You don't know where you're going until the very end. It comes to a hard stop. So that was a nice thing. And the Kirkus, the literary magazine, gave it a surprisingly good review. In fact, when the publishers first said they wanted to send it, I said, "Oh no, please don't! You know, my first book, I'll get hammered." And then they did. And when the review came out, I was shocked. Actually, whoever wrote it, it's an anonymous critic, and he or she, I always think of her as a she. She kind of really got, because she talks about giving women power and stuff like that, and that's what makes me feel that the person who wrote it was a woman, because she gets that part of it. So, no, I haven't got the what would you think? The energy now, or the inspiration to write another book. Yeah. So painting is what I do. But it's too hot. I do it outside, actually, in my porch. So it's 100 degrees. It's a little hot. So
Hopefully it'll get cooler, like in a couple of weeks.
yeah, but I don't mind the heat. I hate the cold. It's the cold I can't bear. But the heat is fine. Yeah. Oh.
I see. For me, it's quite the opposite. I rather be able to put more clothes on rather than take, you know.
It's the opposite.
So looking back on your life, is there like some advice that you give to like some people who might listen to this interview, or like some young people who might, like, you know, might wonder what like life might be like later in the future?
Yes. First and foremost, never accept that you can't do something. People will tell you you're wasting your time. You're doing, don't do this. It's a waste of time, and you really want to do it. And you put your heart and soul into it, and be very tenacious about it. My mother didn't want me to become a cameraman or a director or anything like that. She loved movies. I mean, thanks to her, it was, I loved going to the theater and the arts and all that. But there's that generation of people who thought it's not a proper job, sensible job is to be a doctor, lawyer, engineer. Those are sensible jobs. This is definitely not sensible. That I would agree to, but it's what I wanted. It was my passion, so I did it, and I went through that. So that I would say. I would also tell people that don't be careful about changing jobs. Always don't leave a job until you have a job. It was my single biggest mistake that I made in my life. And that was particularly at CNN. One can't make very good decisions when one is depressed. And so it's worth speaking to friends or someone that you admire, or someone you respect, about something. Don't just take the decision on your own. And as I said, it was a big mistake to leave CNN when I did. But that's the sort of thing I tell people, even young people today, that if you have a job, stay in the job, because you're more likely to be offered a job when you've got a job than when you're out of a job. And then people think, I wonder why he's out of a job. I mean, now he's asking for. Whereas when I was in a job, even at PBS, and I told you the programs that I did, and we were nominated for the Emmy twice and so forth. Jobs came my way. The CNN job came out of the blue. People suddenly, had 15 minutes of fame. So be careful and use it wisely when you have that moment of fame and credibility.
I think that advice is very sound, and I think it will help me a lot in my life too, I think, because I'm planning on becoming a writer. So that's definitely not a conventional job, right? So yeah, thank you.
Let me know. And you're right at Rice, aren't you?
Yeah.
You got to invite you to have lunch with me one day.
Yeah, that would be great. If there's anything else you want to talk about, like any other questions you might want to address or any other topics you might want to talk and delve into, it's still only one hour and 11 minutes, so there's definitely still some time to talk about things if you feel like I've missed anything.
I'm trying to think what else we can talk about.
If there's nothing, that's also fine as well.
I can't immediately think of anything, but I think we've covered quite a lot in the 2 sessions that we've done. And I hope someone in years to come finds that interesting. But I did want to get in some of the stuff because, who knows, we'll listen to this in 2040 or something, long after I've gone. So be interesting from that point of view for people to know what was going on in this time of our lives.
Yeah,
And keep in touch. And as I say, seriously, I'd like to invite you to lunch one day.
that would be great. Yeah. Maybe sometime soon. Yeah.
All right.
Thank you. I'll end the recording now.